Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You must have no other gods before me. Do not make an idol for yourself, no form whatsoever, of anything in the sky above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow down to them or worship them, because I, the Lord your God, am a passionate God. I punish children for their parents' sins, even to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. But I am loyal and gracious to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Do not use the Lord your God's name as if it were of no significance. The Lord won't forgive anyone who uses his name that way. Remember the Sabbath day and treat it as holy. 6 days you may work and do all your tasks, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do not do any work on it. Not you, your sons or daughters, your male or female servants, your animals, or the immigrant who is living with you. Because the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything that is in them in 6 days, but rested on the seventh day. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that your life will be long on the fertile land that the Lord your God is giving you. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not testify falsely against your neighbor. Do not desire your neighbor's house. Do not desire and try to take your neighbor's wife, male or female servant, ox, donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the horn, and the mountain smoking, the people shook with fear and stood at a distance. The word of the Lord.
So this is how it works, right? I get to feeling bad, and instead of letting you off the hook, I subject you to the worst possible parts I could bring you. Me droning on for another 15, 20 minutes, right? Without the benefit of the meeting and the greeting and the handshakes and the hugs, I'm just going to sit here and make you hear me out.
Amen.
I suppose we all have our crosses to bear. So this morning, we listened to what I think was probably a familiar text, but what was it that we were hearing there? And I'll ask that as more than a rhetorical question. What was it that we were hearing this morning?
10 Commandments.
10 Commandments. That was the Sunday school answer, which is technically correct. What else?
Way to get the Israelites back on course.
Okay, I heard the way to get the Israelites back on course. I heard how we should live. I heard something else. Okay, how we should live. Anything else?
Define sins.
Define sins. Okay.
Clean up our act.
And that's probably fairly true, and within the context even fairly true.
I also heard that there will be punishments, maybe through generations.
It was communication with God. It was God's talking to us.
So God was communicating. We heard words of punishment. We saw the side of God we don't talk about very often, maybe, in that regard.
I was very aware when we were hearing the translation and wondering what we were missing.
There is always that at play, and it is just as true today. A passionate God has sometimes been spoken as a jealous God who would punish onto the third generation rather than a passionate God. Anyone hear the beginnings of an identity statement in that? Don't worry if you're looking at me with confused looks. I'm going to explain that one in a moment. But I will take the absence of response for, yep, that one's just you, preacher. Okay. Well, to get there, you have to put this in its context and think about it a little bit more than just the ins and the outs, because we're taught to see the rules that are given, the definitions of sins, the promise of punishment, what is and is not allowed, what's prohibited, what is required. But within this, we can also put it within the context of who these people were, and most importantly, where these people were. How many of you all remember where the commandments were received? Moses was up on Mount Sinai. The people were down at the base. And Moses had been there amongst God to commune, to gather wisdom, his retreat to the mountain, to receive instruction in which he could bring back and lead his community. So this puts us in the historical context of the Israelite people still being wandering in the, well, okay, I want to grab onto that one for just a minute, because the sinful thing, that applies to most periods throughout the book. A lot of the writings we have are a response to, you sinful people, what are you doing? Let's straighten this out. But yes, technically true. But you could answer that one for almost every stage of the Bible. So, anything else? We heard wandering in the desert. What did I hear? Idolatry. I'm getting there. They had just made their golden calf. Say again? Waiting, yes. That's a good answer too. They were anxious. Impatient.
Well, they were 400 years under the Egyptian gods.
Coming out of 400 years in Egypt with their gods, their rule. Absolutely. All of these are correct and true. They're setting the stage, and so we have the Israelites who are finally breaking free from that bondage in Egypt, but have found themselves condemned to 40 years of wandering because they sent their initial party into the promised land to scope out that which God had given them. And of course, they all came back except for two, saying there's no way we could enter this land. The forces there are too powerful. The people are too strong. God, why would you lead us out of slavery and into our deaths? Not understanding the promise wasn't about life or death. The promise was that God would lead them forward. So in response for their unwillingness to act upon God's promise and revealing of that promise, they got 40 years in the wilderness with no parole. 40 years of wandering. In fact, some Jewish texts, some Jewish traditions hold it was 40 years so that they could forget what it meant to be held in bondage in their past. And in some ways, 40 years to lose the bondage of their hearts and minds that a generation was unable to overcome. For in 40 years, the last generation of those who had been slaves in Egypt would die off, and they would hand over the reins of their people and their leadership to the Israelites who were born during their wandering. So what we see here today is the beginnings of a statement of identity as to who they are. It's not just rules about what is prohibited and what is allowed, what is sinful and what can be punished, but it's beginning to set forth on the stage who we will be. While Moses was up in the mountain receiving these words, the people were anxiously looking for a God that they hadn't seen appear. And so they make the golden calf as an idol, so they would have a visual reference for the unseen God. I don't think it's a coincidence that early in the rules we hear about idolatry and having no God before me. Don't make a graven image of me either. Think about this in the context of the world in which they live, in which the people of Israel had known the various gods of Egypt through their time in captivity there, had probably known various gods prior to their time in Egypt as they came and encountered other people with their own gods. Let us not forget that in this time, when we today know God as being the one God, they lived in the land of numerous gods, and a God for this people and this land and that. It was not uncommon to find yourself paying tribute to the God of the land through which you were traveling, if for no other reason than to assure your safety with the people who worshiped the God to whom you made your offering. So here again, some of these rules and these restrictions. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other God before me. How many of us hear that in the metaphorical sense of you worship God and God alone? How many of you hear it in the spatial sense of there will be no God who is set before me? Probably not most of us. We don't think about that because we don't have representations of our God. I'm blaming the sickness for that one. But in a land of many gods, in which a pantheon could contain the idols and the altars to any number of gods, to hear, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other God before me, as a spatial directive, as some scholars think it may have been, was a reminder, if you find yourself in the pantheon, don't set any gods in front of me. I am a jealous God, and I don't want to see them. But then goes right into the next prescription, which is, don't make an idol of me either. A troublesome one, if the idea was, don't set any idols before my idol, and now, by the way, don't make any idols either. You're beginning to hear what will become the roots of the monotheism of Israel, and that these rules are starting to lay out, I am the one God, don't make an idol of me. And in not having an idol, by the way, you can't set any other gods before me. Well, how does one accomplish that when there is no idol to measure what is in front of? God is beginning to establish a new pattern of rules and behavior, but is also beginning to establish a new identity for God's people, a new way of being. Listen to some of the other commandments in a new way. Thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not murder, depending on your translation. This one seems like a no-brainer. We all agree murder is bad. But think about it in the context of being able to be in contact with people of other faiths that might still offer blood sacrifices of human lives. You shall not murder means do not sacrifice one another in God's name. Don't commit adultery. In a world in which they come into contact with other people of other different faiths, in which part of their religious practices were temple prostitutes and other fertility worship activities that involved ritual sexuality. Do not commit adultery. Don't do that fertility stuff in my temple. Don't be like the other religions. Be my people and follow my way. So we find ourselves with a people who are sentenced to 40 years in the desert to unlearn their old ways, and then are given a set of rules that codify a new way. These aren't just about setting the boundaries of what is and isn't acceptable. It's about setting a boundary and through which you can become God's people. God is inviting them to grow past that early moment when they refuse to see the promised land as God providing a way and an identity for them, and giving them another chance to begin to move forward. In its own way, God is inviting them to grow. In this moment, God isn't just setting the rules so that they will know what to follow and what not. God is creating a pattern by which they can begin to lead their lives. A new way of being for the people of Israel as they prepare to go in a new land and be God's chosen again. It's easy to look at something like the idea of growing and think of it simplistically as humans, we all grow physically, and perhaps even grow in spirit, grow in our emotions. As church, the temptation is to always look at growing and see how many did we pack into our pews today? Is that up or down from last week? And forget that part of growing is defining who we are within these pews in the first place. What are the 10 commandments that guide us? What is the story that God has told us that helps us to define who we are as God's people, and not just as Christians, but as this body of Christians here in this place? Is God offering us a new story? Have we been in the wilderness all along and didn't even realize it? Is it time to find a new path, a new identity, and a new way, knowing that it will open the doors to the promised land that we were not expecting? Building on what we learned in the past 2 weeks from the book Thrive, The Spiritual Habits of Transforming Congregations, we learned that prayer was essential to our work. And not just the ability to speak eloquently to God, but to use prayer as a way to step back and find ourselves at peace in a world that gives us no peace. Because as we continue to step back, we will be invited then to wake up to the changing world around us, to awaken ourselves to the fact that maybe we are being called out of the wilderness and into a new promise, to give up that old way of being in order to embrace something new. And to do so will require that we grow. And not necessarily in the physical or the numerical, but to require that we grow beyond the stories that we have told or the ways that we have been. What old gods and idols have we allowed to set on our pantheon next to our Christ, our Holy Spirit, our unseen God? What ways of being have we created into idols that we maybe have even set in front of our jealous God, that it is now time to cast away and grow into a new way of being? The first steps into the promised land are never, ever easy. The journey to get there takes time, and it requires shedding the old in order to embrace the new. Sometimes requires forgetting the old in order to learn something different. But in order to grow, we have to discern what it is that defines us as children of God, as followers of the Christ, as people of the Holy Spirit. I hope we might find a time in this looking back, this celebrating of our first 100 years, to also begin to take stock of the stories that have defined us, the stories which will continue to root us and ground us, and perhaps even take note of the stories that have elevated themselves to the idols that we put before our God, that it is time to set aside and move behind. We all face these moments in our lives, and we will face these moments in the lives of our community. But the one truth we hold is that God is still calling us forward. This reading sells us short because it doesn't get us into the promise. In fact, it sells us way short because we're in Exodus chapter 20, and to begin making that journey in, we have to get all the way to the book of Joshua, and we've actually got a little way to go to get there, chronologically and chapter-wise, and perhaps the same can be said of us. But at the end of the day, we know where the story leads if we but trust God to get us there and to open ourselves to the growth that God is calling us to live. So may we find our way forward. May we find the commandments that God is offering, the story that God is giving, so that we might ground ourselves again as a congregation who's been here for 100 years and who will be here for 100 more. Amen? Amen. Amen.